Hey guys, tonight we are going to unveil a story about the woman who risked everything and nearly lost it all. Under the shadow of the crown, a terrifying secret of the Tudor dynasty. What happens when the brother you love the most, King Henry VIII, becomes the cruelest betrayer of your life? This is the tragedy of Margaret Tudor. She gave up her esteemed regency crown for a passionate marriage, only to be deceived by that very husband. When she was backed into a corner, she sought deliverance from Henry VIII, but that brother did not offer comfort. He offered a cold political arrangement instead. Margaret is the sister forgotten by history, but she is the only woman who survived, manipulated, and ultimately outplayed the most dangerous king in England in a game of power that lasted for decades. If you were born only to be a diplomatic pawn, would you dare tear up the peace treaty to seize your own destiny? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as usual, let me know where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to know how many of us are traveling together into the night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Margaret Tudor was born in the year 1489 as the first daughter of King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth of York. Her grandmother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, renowned for her discreet authority and political acumen behind the scenes of the English court, played a pivotal role in securing the Tudor dynasty's hold on the throne after the death of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in the year 1488. Her grandfather, Henry Tudor, the first of his name to bear the Tudor surname, vanquished the House of York and founded a new, tumultuous dynasty. In that charged atmosphere, little Princess Margaret entered the world as a symbol of hope nurtured in silks and velvet, yet burdened by political expectations from her earliest days. Her father, Henry VII, though he had consolidated his reign, remained ever vigilant against plots and internal rivalries. He required rock-solid diplomatic alliances to prevent his court from fracturing. Among his most valuable diplomatic tokens was Margaret herself with her golden locks and clear, thoughtful gaze. She grew up in the magnificent Eltham Palace, where pristine white stone walls reflected flickering candlelight and long corridors echoed with the soft clack of wooden clogs. From her first steps, every gesture was watched by courtiers. Her smile had to be measured, her eyes never too sorrowful, and her voice gentle, yet suitably regal. Alongside Margaret was her younger brother, Prince Henry, born in the year 1491, trained to become a great heir, who would later gain fame and infamy through 6 marriages and a landmark royal divorce. There was also her sister, Princess Mary, born in the year 1496, nicknamed the Tudor Rose for her demure beauty and noble bearing. Mary would one day capture the hearts of the French court when she wed King Louis XII. Shortly after Margaret celebrated her 6th birthday, a royal decree announced that she would become the future Queen Consort of Scotland. In the year 1501, she was pledged in marriage to King James IV of Scotland, a man 16 years her senior. This union was not born of love, but designed to cement a perpetual peace between England and Scotland, a strategic move by Henry VII. To the English court, Margaret was a diplomatic instrument. To the 12-year-old girl, it was a farewell to childhood and the beginning of life as a bride in a distant land, where she would learn to suppress her emotions and smile before any crowd. Before she could adjust to her new title of Queen of Scots, Margaret endured a heartbreaking blow. During a single week in the year 1503, she witnessed the death of her prematurely born baby sibling, and shortly thereafter, the sudden passing of her mother, Queen Elizabeth. The compounded grief cracked her young spirit. Her father, unwilling to let his daughter languish in mourning, immediately ordered her to Edinburgh. One week she knelt in silent sorrow beside her mother's bier. The next she wore the Scottish crown, stepping into an unfamiliar palace, filled with solemnity and a quiet, pervasive sadness. At the end of that summer, Margaret donned a resplendent ceremony gown, trimmed with gold and pearls, and processed into Holyrood Abbey to the tolling of bells and triumphant hymns. Citizens lined the streets, cheering as James IV vaulted onto his mount without stirrups, cracked his whip, and then lifted Margaret into the saddle beside him. To onlookers, It appeared a scene of freedom and glory. Yet within Margaret's heart, a single, persistent question reverberated. Was this truly freedom, or merely a gilded prison from which she could never reclaim her lost childhood? As the echoes of victory drums faded, she closed her eyes and softly wondered, would I trade my childhood dreams for this icy crown? From that moment, Margaret's bittersweet journey began, one in which power and sorrow would intertwine with every step she took along those cold stone corridors. The echo of wedding bells had barely faded before the true trials of queenly life began to unfold. Margaret endured 6 long, painful pregnancies, each a testament to her duty and love. Yet only one, her son, Prince James, survived the fragile days of infancy. The joy of motherhood was forever shadowed by the loss of each little life that never had the chance to grow. In the quiet moments, Margaret would cradle her living child close and wonder, with a tired heart, if the cry of each departed infant was a sorrowful toll, foretelling the harsh fate that lay ahead. In the year 1509, news reached Scotland that King Henry VII had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Almost at once, Margaret's younger brother, Henry VIII, claimed the English throne. His ascension brought with it fresh winds of conflict, for England's new king wasted no time in renewing hostilities with France. Scotland, bound by a sacred treaty to Paris, found itself thrust into the vortex of war. King James IV, honouring his oath, mustered his armies and prepared to meet the English on the field of battle. Margaret, caught between her beloved brother, flushed with the pride of victory, and the husband she adored, now donned in the armour of war, sensed the fragile peace, already bloodied, threatening to crack apart entirely. As the Battle of Flodden loomed near, Margaret's nights were haunted by visions of James falling from some distant cliff, his crown tumbling from his head as he plummeted into darkness. Each nightmare left her heart pounding, an omen that could not be ignored. Then, on the 9th of September, 1513, terror struck. King James IV perished in a brutal clash at Flodden Field. Nearly 10,000 Scottish soldiers lay wounded or dead upon the sodden ground. In the stillness of Linlithgow Palace, Margaret waited in strained silence for word of her husband's fate. No messenger arrived with confirmation, only a hollow dread that filled the empty corridors. To add insult to immeasurable grief, Margaret's sister-in-law, Queen Catherine of Aragon, dispatched James's blood-soaked coat to Henry VIII as a grim token of victory. That single cruel gesture cut deep. It was not merely the triumph of arms, but a chilling betrayal by family. The world that once promised permanence and unity now seemed to mock her suffering. With her heart broken and her role altered forever, Margaret became a widow at the age of 24. Yet her sorrow was not allowed the luxury of solitude. In his last will, King James IV appointed Margaret as Regent of Scotland until their son reached his 18th year. Overnight she was thrust into the highest seat of power in a kingdom drowning in mourning. But the mantle of regency, heavy as it was, soon proved fraught with suspicion. Many Scottish nobles viewed Margaret as twofold a threat. Both a woman traditionally considered unsuited to wield such authority, and an Englishwoman, the sister of the very king whose forces had slain their beloved monarch. Whispers of disloyalty spread like wildfire through the great halls of Holyrood. Critics accused her of leaning toward England, of betraying Scottish interests for her brother's gain. Misogyny and xenophobia intertwined to undermine every decision Margaret made. Lords who once bowed low now crossed their arms, eyes narrowing with doubt. Formal councils convened not to seek her counsel but to challenge her every edict. Peers muttered darkly that a woman could never truly govern, much less one beholden to the crown that had destroyed their own. Even the courtiers closest to Margaret watched for any sign of English influence, eager to pounce on any misstep. Despite the crushing weight of grief and betrayal, Margaret pressed on, determined to uphold the late king's will. She convened assemblies to care for widows of fallen soldiers, arranged funds to rebuild shattered villages, and petitioned foreign dignitaries for aid in stabilizing the kingdom. Yet each act of compassion was met with renewed scrutiny. A grant of grain to border towns was labelled collusion with England. A plea for French assistance was decried as favouritism toward her young son's heritage. In every direction there was censure. Through it all, Margaret carried the quiet burden of a mother and regent, her pale hands writing decrees even as her soul mourned. Each night she would light a single candle in her private chapel, kneel before a simple wooden cross, and pray for strength. The walls around her, once echoing with regal splendor, now seemed to press inward with the weight of expectation. In the hush before dawn, Margaret often whispered to the empty room, "Grant me patience, grant me wisdom, and grant me peace. I clee." Thus, while the nation teetered on the brink of further civil unrest, Margaret Tudor stood unwavering, a lone figure poised between sorrow and duty. Her son, the young James, slept under heavy blankets in a distant bedchamber, his dreams unaware of the storms swirling above. And Margaret, the grieving widow crowned by bereavement and suspicion, prepared to navigate the treacherous currents of power in a land she still loved, though it now viewed her with wary eyes. In the spring of 1514, though Margaret was already exhausted from childbirth and expecting her second child, the weight of regency pressed down upon her like a shroud. The court buzzed with resentment and thinly veiled contempt. When the princess bore Prince Alexander, the nobles grew impatient. They demanded that the dowager queen relinquish her royal position and hand both young princes over to their custody. In her despair, Margaret turned to her brother, King Henry VIII of England. Although his embrace lacked the warmth of sibling affection, he arranged her escape from Scotland nonetheless. Thus, heavily pregnant and cloaked in controversy, Margaret slipped away from the palace halls, trailing behind her the whispered mockery of courtiers who questioned her strength and loyalty. On foreign soil, isolated and vulnerable, Margaret soon delivered another daughter. Yet tragedy refused to release its grip. Prince Alexander, her second-born son, died before reaching his second birthday. The news struck her heart with the force of 1,000 daggers. In her grief-stricken fury, Margaret accused the Duke of Albany, who had replaced her in the regency, of poisoning the child. Whether the allegation bore any truth mattered less than the desperate assertion of her own authority and the preservation of her dignity in the face of scorn. By the year 1517, the woman once dismissed as a weak foreigner returned to Scotland, with newly honed resolve and cunning. Archibald Douglas, her second husband, betrayed her again upon his return. He reappeared with his former mistress, squandering Margaret's wealth on lavish entertainments and flaunting his infidelity before a court already primed to condemn her. What began as personal anguish soon unfolded into political opportunity. Recognizing that Douglas had overreached, Margaret reached out to the Duke of Albany, once her adversary, and forged a pragmatic alliance to remove Douglas from power. In November of 1521, their plan unfolded with breathtaking precision. Under the cloak of night, Albany's forces surrounded Douglas's strongholds while Margaret rallied her loyal supporters in Edinburgh. At dawn, Douglas found himself stripped of authority, his titles revoked, and his supporters scatterbrained. Margaret, poised beside Albany, walked triumphantly through the city gates. The stunned citizenry looked on as the former Queen Regent strode into the capital flanked by her new ally. It was not merely an act of vengeance, it was a masterstroke of political strategy and personal vindication. The message was clear. Margaret Tudor would not be trifled with. Yet newly reclaimed power brought fresh trials. Rumours began to swirl throughout the smoky taverns and gilded salons of Edinburgh. Whispers of a secret liaison between Margaret and Albany, murmurs that the two shared more than a political partnership. In the unforgiving realm of court intrigue, such insinuations spread like wildfire, fanned by rivals eager to undermine her success. Suggestive glances and half-heard conversations fed the gossip mill, casting a shadow over what had been a brilliantly executed coup. Margaret, mindful of the precarious balance she maintained, responded not with public denials but with measured composure. She continued to issue decrees, hold audiences, and oversee the rebuilding of estates damaged by years of conflict. Yet in hushed corners, envoys reported that the once widowed Queen Regent now possessed an air of steely confidence, mixed with a hint of personal secrecy. Nobles who had doubted her resolve now debated whether to align themselves with her faction or risk marginalization. The political landscape trembled under this new uncertainty. All the while, Margaret carried the remnants of her grief close to her chest. Late at night, candlelight flickering against cold stone walls, she would recall the infant faces she had nurtured and lost. She would remember the whispered comforts of her brother and the harsh betrayal of those she once trusted. In those quiet hours, when sleep hovered just beyond reach, the lines between duty and desire blurred, and through it all the question echoed softly in the corridors of power. What would one sacrifice to heal a shattered heart? As the chill of early winter crept back into the air, and the court prepared for another season of feast and diplomacy, Margaret Tudor stood at a crossroads of her own making. Regent, widow, mother, and strategist, each role demanding its price. The eyes of Scotland watched, waiting to see whether the woman who had outwitted her enemies could also transcend the whispers and secure her legacy beyond mere vengeance. Inside Westminster, a subtle wind of espionage began to stir. Sister Isabella Hopringle, a nun whom Margaret had once held dear, proved to be the most perilous link in her inner circle. Unseen by many, Isabella carried whispers from the Scottish court directly into the hearing of Henry VIII. Each time tensions flared between the two kingdoms, murmurs from Margaret's household drifted south of the border, leaving Scotland in a state of uneasy limbo. Victory felt hollow, and defeat tasted bitter. When the Scottish lords finally uncovered Isabella's betrayals, they threatened the convent with severe punishment. Yet despite the clear danger, Margaret intervened to shield her once trusted friend, placing loyalty above retribution. In her heart, she believed that compassion could redeem even the gravest of treacheries. Isabella, however, never forgot this mercy, and in the years that followed, she repaid it by betraying Margaret again and again. Time flowed onward, and by the year 1524, Margaret's son, James V, formally ascended to the Scottish throne. The delight that often accompanies a coronation was muted by the lingering aftershocks of personal power struggles. Archibald Douglas, Margaret's second husband, though deprived of his earlier authority, remained determined to reclaim his stature. Across the seas in England, Henry VIII urged his sister to reconcile with Douglas, hoping to smooth political frictions. But Margaret, her spirit still scarred by past humiliations, steadfastly refused to forgive the man who had so often dishonoured her. In a calculated move born of desperation, Douglas rallied a faction of nobles and, under cover of night, stormed the Scottish Parliament itself. Their goal was unambiguous: strip Margaret of her regency and seize the throne for themselves, despite the fact that King James was only 14 years of age. Faced with this threat, Margaret penned a desperate letter to her old ally, the Duke of Albany. In measured yet urgent handwriting, she vowed she would sacrifice all, even her claim to the crown, if it meant safeguarding her young son. The letter carried the weight of a mother's plea: "I stand ready to give everything for the protection of the prince." But by a cruel twist of fate, her words fell into the hands of Henry VIII. The English king's fury was immediate and severe. News of Margaret's secret appeal to Albany, long considered an enemy, tore through her heart like a blade. Confronted with the prospect of his sister conspiring with her rivals, Henry's wrath knew no bounds. In panic and confusion, Margaret felt compelled to abandon her alliance with Albany and reopen negotiations with Douglas. Though it pained her deeply, she believed this was the only path to spare her son further peril. Yet Douglas's newfound position proved ephemeral. By the year 1526, he held full custodial control over James V, dictating every aspect of the young king's education and upbringing. Under Douglas's watch, James became a pawn in a game of power, groomed to distance himself from both his mother and his uncle, Henry VIII. Locked away in Stirling Castle and denied the comforting presence of his parents, the prince faced an arduous struggle. Abandoned by the two most important figures in his life, he would ultimately have to rely on his own courage to break free. 3 grueling years passed in this manner, years marked by Margaret's anguish and James's quiet rebellion. When they finally reunited, James scarcely recognized the woman who had once stood boldly at the funeral of his father. Time and sorrow had etched lines upon her face. The vibrant countenance of his youth had been replaced by a visage touched by suffering. Yet alongside Margaret in those later days stood Henry Stuart, a young nobleman recently granted royal favour. His swift rise and intimate proximity to the Dowager Queen sparked a fresh round of speculation. Whispered rumours circulated that Margaret and Stuart were more than allies, that they perhaps shared a bond that went beyond politics. Some spoke of clandestine meetings in candlelit corridors. Others hinted at a concealed pregnancy. As gossip swelled, Margaret's once prominent presence in matters of state began to recede. Courtiers, who had once scrambled to curry favour, now glanced sidelong, their expressions clouded with doubt. They questioned both her judgment and her loyalty, wondering if her heart had strayed as far as her conjugal ties had unravelled. Even Albany watched these developments with cautious interest, his own ambitions simmering beneath a mask of courtesy. Through it all, Margaret navigated a landscape fraught with peril, her legacy as queen, mother, and regent tethered to the fleeting allegiances of men and the whispered suspicions of courtiers. Late at night, when the castle fell silent and only the wind rattled the leaded windows, she would close her eyes and summon memories of gentler times, holding baby James, dreaming of peace between kingdoms, trusting those she loved. In those moments, a singular question echoed softly in her mind. Can a heart broken so often still find the strength to trust? And as dawn broke over Stirling's turrets, Margaret, weary yet resolute, prepared to face another day in the unending chess game of thrones and hearts. With her legal card finally in hand, Archibald Douglas having been bound by a prior engagement when he wed her, Margaret achieved a decisive victory in court and secured her divorce. Instead of savouring her newfound freedom, however, she swiftly married Lord Methven. This union, intended to offer fresh hope, tragically echoed her past. Methven proved reckless and extravagant, draining her coffers on lavish entertainments and neglecting the domestic duties expected of a lord. Margaret found herself once more entangled in debts, both monetary and emotional, as the man she trusted squandered the fortune she had fought so hard to regain. By the year 1528, James V had reached his majority and assumed full royal authority. Margaret, who had guided the kingdom through its darkest days, was now relegated to the margins of political power. The mother and son, once bound by tender devotion, grew estranged. James refused to allocate funds for her household and turned away from her counsel. In the shadowy corridors of the Scottish court, Margaret's soft petitions for assistance echoed unanswered. Yet she persisted, continuing to dispatch letters to her brother, Henry VIII, pleading for monetary aid and disclosing sensitive court intrigues. Each missive, signed in trembling script, risked further inflaming the simmering mistrust between her and her son. Such actions fanned the flames of the final betrayal in their relationship. Rumours spread like wildfire. The Dowager Queen was accused of spying for England, a betrayal more grievous than any personal slight. Some whispered that she had leaked state secrets to Henry VIII, hoping to regain his favour. Others claimed she had plotted behind James's back to restore her own influence. Court gossipers spoke in hushed tones of secret meetings and hidden correspondence, painting Margaret as a deceitful instrument of a foreign power. In these dark days, she found that even the blood ties of monarchy could not shield her from the sharpest sting of treachery. Then came the late summer of 1541. At the age of 51, Margaret Tudor suffered a sudden stroke. She was carried to her chambers in a state of fragile consciousness, her breathing shallow, her vision blurred. The castle fell eerily silent as attendants gathered around her bed, fear etched on every face. James V, now a seasoned monarch, was absent, occupied with matters of state that could not be delayed. Margaret, in her final moments, called softly for her son, but he did not arrive in time. As the candlelight flickered and her breath grew faint, she murmured prayers for forgiveness and peace. And then, with a last gentle sigh, she passed away, alone in a foreign land, leaving behind only a stack of unanswered petitions to the English court, and a heart heavy with long-deferred regrets. Despite the tumult that marked her life, tragic romances, shifting allegiances, the sting of intrigue and betrayal, the legacy of Margaret Tudor endured in her descendants. She was the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots, whose own life would echo the dramas of her grandmother's. She was also the ancestress of James I of England, the first to unite the crowns of Scotland and England under a single ruler. It was Margaret, not her more famous brother, Henry VIII, who laid the groundwork for the future dynasty. Through wars and widowing, through exile and exile, she bore the torch of Tudor ambition forward. In the final tally of history, the journey of the ill-fated princess became a testament to the resilience of a woman who rose again and again from the ashes of shattered dreams. For in every broken promise and every act of betrayal, Margaret Tudor discovered within herself a singular, enduring strength, the power to stand tall amidst ruin, and to shape a lineage that would carry her name into eternity. The coup with Albany had seemed to herald Margaret's return to genuine power, yet the shadows in her own household proved more perilous than any external foe. Isabella Hopringle, a gentle-voiced nun whom Margaret once trusted as a confidant, emerged as a silent traitor. While Margaret and the Duke of Albany laboured to extinguish the flames of war, Isabella slipped through corridors cloaked in habit, carrying every whispered stratagem, every hidden intrigue, to the courts of King Henry VIII. Her missives transformed Scottish hopes of peace into anxious uncertainty. Time and again, Edinburgh's council heard rumours of French armies on the march, or English troops gathering near the border, all based on letters penned by their own Queen Regent's handmaid. The betrayal, once uncovered, sent ripples of outrage throughout the Scottish nobility. Many demanded that Isabella, and by extension, her entire convent face severe punishment for treason. Margaret found herself torn between justice and mercy. She remembered the sisterly smiles, the shared prayers in the chapel's dim light, and the trust she had placed in Isabella's devotion. To condemn her friend would be to admit a fatal error in judgment, to stain her own honour with blood. Still, the whispers of traitor echoed in the marble halls, each accusation a dagger aimed at the heart of the Regency. After nights of agonised reflection, Margaret made her choice. Though her advisers urged swift and harsh retribution, she interceded on Isabella's behalf, securing clemency for the convent and promising that punishment would fall only upon the nun herself. The act was a testament to Margaret's enduring faith in mercy, even when cruelty seemed the safer path. Yet Isabella, like a curse bound to her benefactress, repaid the kindness with further deceit. More confidential dispatches found their way into Henry VIII's hands, unravelling every effort Margaret and Albany made to stabilise the realm. It was a bitter lesson. Beneath the gilded canopy of the crown, friend and foe could stand indistinguishably close. Meanwhile, beyond the cold stones of Holyrood and Stirling, the uneasy, perpetual peace teetered on collapse. England and Scotland, once aligned in mutual accord, now found themselves on the verge of renewed conflict, spurred by Isabella's clandestine correspondence. Margaret bore witness to a scene of heartbreak on both sides of the border. Scottish villages hollowed by fear, English towns braced for invasion. Carts laden with grain passed silently through customs posts, carrying relief to the starving. Musketeers and pikemen drilled along the Firth of Forth, preparing for the call to arms. The Queen Regent, exhausted by the burden of governance and betrayed by her closest ally, questioned whether all the sacrifices of loyalty, love, and honour meant anything at all when the crown itself became a vessel for treachery. On one windswept evening, Margaret stood atop the ramparts of Edinburgh Castle, watching the North Sea waves crash against dark cliffs. The roar of the tide merged with the moans of the wind, as though nature itself mourned the state of human affairs. She closed her eyes, feeling the cold spray upon her face, and whispered into the gathering dusk, "What worth have trust and compassion when they are repaid with lies and betrayal?" Below her, torches flickered in bastions where soldiers kept watch, alert to any movement across the northern hills. The city lights gleamed like pinpricks in the darkness, tentative beacons of hope in a world teetering on the edge of violence. Yet even in that moment of despair, Margaret recognized that her choice mercy over vengeance was not in vain. It preserved the fragile moral fabric of her regency, proving that compassion could endure even when tested by the darkest of human impulses. She understood that to wield power without mercy would render her no better than those tyrants she had opposed. And though history might judge her for pardoning Isabella Hopringle, Margaret knew in her quiet heart that she had upheld the highest ideals of her Christian faith. As the night deepened and the chill settled into her bones, Margaret descended from the parapets and returned to her private chambers. There, in the soft glow of a single candle, she penned letters of her own pleas for unity, calls for restraint, and silent prayers for a day when Scotland and England might genuinely embrace peace. The quill scratched across parchment, each word a testament to her unyielding hope. And though her soul bore the weight of betrayal, her spirit remained unbroken, guided by the belief that even in the coldest corridors of power, mercy could light the way. In the year 1524, the boy King James V formally ascended to the Scottish throne, and Margaret Tudor dared to hope that her years of relentless toil and heartbreak might finally yield a measure of peace. Yet scarcely had she set down her regent's seal when fresh sorrow found her door. Archibald Douglas, her second husband, nursing a grudge for his public disgrace, levelled a treacherous accusation against Margaret. That she intended to isolate the young king, seize the reins of power for herself, and cast aside the rightful heir. With this slander, Douglas coerced the Scottish Parliament into granting him authority to govern in James's name. Under cover of night, he ordered the boy be confined within the walls of Falkland Palace, effectively holding him hostage in his own land. Margaret, aghast at Douglas's audacity, would not remain passive. Summoning all her courage, she composed a solemn letter to the Duke of Albany, her erstwhile ally who had since fallen into opposition with Douglas. In measured, earnest words, she pledged, "I would rather stand beside you in battle than allow Douglas a single footfall upon the throne." Believing that Albany's strategic mind and military backing could rescue her son, she entrusted the letter to a discreet courier. Yet tragedy struck when the parchment fell into the hands of her brother, King Henry VIII of England. Already embittered by memories of his sister's flight from Scotland, Henry erupted in fury, denouncing Margaret as a traitor to her own son. His wrath burned with the heat of personal betrayal. Panicked and beset by threats from both brother and husband, Margaret faced an impossible choice. To persist in her alliance with Albany risked open war with England. To refuse it threatened Douglas's further consolidation of power. In her desperation, she swallowed her pride and reopened channels of negotiation with Douglas, seeking to placate him and secure her son's release. Yet power's fickle currents soon turned against her once more. By the year 1526, Douglas was officially appointed guardian of James V, wielding the young king's very authority as a weapon. He orchestrated James's upbringing at Stirling Castle, denying Margaret any access to her child. From her distant chambers, she could only hear echoes of the castle bells and the faint footsteps of her son's daily routines, sounds that now tormented her. 3 long years passed under this iron grip. Margaret's days were filled with restless nights, haunted by memories of lullabies and cradle songs. She imagined James's small hand in hers, the warmth of his childhood laughter, the soft press of his cheek against her shoulder. And yet, all that remained were ghostly recollections, as the formidable Douglas ensured that mother and son would not meet. Yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, Margaret never relented in her prayers or her petitions to the court, pleading for a chance to see her boy once more. Then, one crisp autumn morning, word arrived that James V had escaped the confines of Stirling Castle. With courage and the aid of loyal supporters, he had slipped past Douglas's guards and ridden toward Edinburgh. Rumours raced through the streets like wildfire. The young king was returning to reclaim his birthright. Margaret's heart trembled with hope and fear as she awaited his approach. When James finally entered the regal halls of Holyrood Palace, he stood before his mother, not as the child who once clung to her skirts, but as a royal figure tall and resolute. His armour gleamed faintly in the torchlight, and his gaze, though kind, held a curious distance. Margaret, her hair streaked with silver and her face etched by years of worry, stepped forward with trembling hands. In that moment of reunion, joy and sorrow entwined. She felt the long years of separation melt away for an instant, yet the sight of her grown son made her realize how much time had been stolen. James reached out with firm resolve, and Margaret pressed his hand against her cheek. Their eyes met hers filled with unshed tears, his wide with wonder at the woman who had sacrificed so much. In that silent embrace, they shared the weight of their shared history, the betrayals, the battles of politics, the nights spent apart by stone and steel. The warmth of his presence rekindled the tenderness of earlier days, but both knew that nothing could truly restore the innocent bond of mother and child lost to the demands of crown and country. As Edinburgh's autumn winds whispered through the corridors, Margaret and James stood together, facing a future that neither could have predicted. Though the path to reconciliation would be long and fraught with the scars of the past. In that moment, the Dowager Queen and the young king found solace in the simple truth that even the harshest separation could not extinguish the enduring power of a mother's love. In the dim corridors of the royal court, Margaret found herself drawn to Henry Stuart, a young nobleman whom her brother, King Henry VIII, had graciously endowed with a string of prestigious titles. Stuart's presence at Margaret's side during state councils and audiences quickly fueled court gossip. Whispers of a late-life romance and rumours that the Dowager Queen carried an illicit pregnancy fluttered through Edinburgh's stone passages like restless birds. Courtiers speculated that Margaret, having endured heartbreak and political betrayal, sought solace in Stuart's company, using this newfound affection to fill the void left by her years of estrangement from her son, James V. Despite the hush of scandal, Margaret wielded the law as deftly as she had once commanded armies. She unearthed a critical document, proving that Archibald Douglas, her second husband, had been betrothed, and possibly even married, to another woman before his union with her. Armed with this evidence, Margaret petitioned the Scottish courts for an annulment on the grounds of illicit matrimony. The judges, acknowledging the incontrovertible proof, decreed that Margaret was free and single once more. In a single stroke, she reclaimed her legal independence, a triumph echoing louder than any battlefield victory she had once secured. One might have imagined that, liberated from the binds of a failed marriage, Margaret would at last taste freedom's sweet breath. Yet fate proved cruelly ironic. Lady Methven, Margaret's chosen third spouse, soon reenacted the patterns of Douglas's perfidy. Methven indulged in riotous living and reckless spending, squandering Margaret's wealth on lavish feasts and secret assignations. Rumours swirled of his continued intrigues with mistresses. Each whispered name a blow to Margaret's fragile trust. The coffers she had painstakingly replenished during years of regency dwindled under Methven's careless hand, leaving her estates burdened by debt and her heart hollowed by disillusionment. For a second time, Margaret faced the same empty chamber. No royal throne to call her own, no steadfast partner by her side, only the faint echo of past glories and the weight of squandered fortune. Nights found her pacing moonlit halls, her silk slippers whispering on polished stone, as she pondered how the promise of a new marriage had dissolved into yet another betrayal. In the deepest hours, she wondered whether youth's hope of a fresh start had been a cruel illusion. Once she had fled to England with dreams of renewal. Now, nearly halfway through her 51 years, she found herself longing for the peace that remained forever just beyond her grasp. Surrounded by portraits of Tudor ancestors and the silent witness of ancient tapestries, Margaret reflected on the ironies woven through her life. That legal triumph could so swiftly turn to personal defeat, that compassion shown to traitors could be repaid with double treachery. She recalled the countless evenings spent brokering peace between warring factions and the mornings she had spent alone, nursing grief for lost children. Each shattered marriage had taught her a painful lesson, that the crown she wore was no shield against broken vows. As spring's first light filtered through her chamber windows, painting the tapestries with soft gold, Margaret penned yet another petition, this time to no one, merely a record of her weary thoughts. She wrote of the emptiness that had become her constant companion, of the debtors knocking at her doors, of the whispered rumours that shadowed her every step. In careful lines, she confessed that the search for tranquility often led her back into the labyrinth of court intrigue, where hope and despair chased each other like restless phantoms. Thus, as the world outside prepared for summer festivals and tournaments, Margaret Tudor remained confined within her own private turmoil. She had once been regent of a kingdom, a mother to a king, a woman of unmatched resolve. Yet here she stood unwed twice over, betrayed thrice, her dignity frayed by the very institutions she had once upheld. In the quiet hush before dawn, she wondered whether true peace was ever meant for those born into power, or if such souls were destined to wander forever between the promise of freedom and the reality of sorrow. After the year 1528, Margaret Tudor's political power quietly slipped away. With her son James V firmly in control, she found herself reduced to the status of a silent citizen within the walls of Holyrood Palace, honoured in title as the king's mother, yet devoid of any real influence or authority. The regal halls that once rang with her decrees now echoed only with the muted footfalls of courtiers. Day after day, she watched James preside over state affairs without seeking her counsel. Their mother-son bond, once tender, had become stiflingly distant. He withheld financial support for her household and dismissed her pleadings for assistance. Each letter she sent to her brother, Henry VIII, entreaties for funds to ransom her beloved daughter, Lady Margaret Douglas, remained unanswered or was delayed by weeks. Night after night, Margaret waited by her desk, quill trembling in her fingers as she inscribed line after line of heartfelt syntax. "Dear brother," she wrote again and again, "I implore your kindness to restore my daughter to me." Yet each missive seemed to drift into a void, swallowed by court politics and Henry's own preoccupations. The absence of reply weighed heavily upon her, a reminder that familial bonds could be strained by the demands of throne and office. Meanwhile, Archibald Douglas, the very man whose prior betrayal had cost her everything, continued to haunt the corridors of power. Though he no longer held official office, he wielded influence by spreading dark insinuations and enlisting allies to file lawsuits aimed at restoring his lost privileges. Margaret, recognizing the danger he posed to her son and the realm, resorted to her final tactic. She disseminated a startling rumour that Douglas had plotted to assassinate James V. The Scottish lords, once divided, now stood in stunned silence, torn between disbelief and the fear that such treachery might be true. The mere hint of a regicidal plot shook the very foundation of court protocol. Despite formal warnings and threats of execution, Douglas escaped any lasting punishment, his close ties to Henry VIII shielding him from the full force of Scottish justice. The courts, bound by treaties and diplomatic conventions, found themselves unable to detain him indefinitely. Each time a judge moved to indict him, a royal envoy arrived to intercede on his behalf, citing interwoven family connections and the delicate balance of Anglo-Scottish relations. Thus, Douglas's ghost continued to loom over Margaret's waning years, a perpetual reminder of her own vulnerability and the fragility of power. As Margaret entered the final months of her life, the combined weight of advancing age and persistent illness bent her form. Gone were the days when she strode through Holyrood in regal procession. Now she rested in a modest chamber, its walls lined with prayers and faded portraits of ancestors long past. She spent her hours in quiet reflection, her thoughts drifting inevitably to her children. Prince James V, once an infant cradled in her arms, was now a sovereign she barely recognized, his letters formal, his tone distant. And Lady Margaret Douglas, her spirited daughter, had fallen prey to her own romantic entanglements. The young princess's affair with an English guard had landed her in the Tower of London, a further wound in Margaret's maternal heart. In her last surviving letter to Henry VIII, penned with a hand weakened by fever, Margaret made one final desperate plea. She addressed him plainly as, "My dear brother," a term heavy with both reproach and longing. She begged him to deliver Lady Margaret Douglas from her prison, to restore her to her mother's arms, writing as though their shared blood could compel his mercy. The letter trembled with the dual passions of indignation and yearning, indignation at the court's neglect of family duty, and yearning for a bond that once offered her comfort. "I beseech you," she wrote, "do not leave me bereft of my last remaining child." Days later, in early autumn of 1541, Margaret Tudor succumbed to the stroke that had long threatened her. She passed in solitude, the candlelight flickering over her pale features as she breathed her final sigh. The corridors remained hushed, the courtiers too stunned to speak. James V arrived only after she had departed from this world, his grief mingled with regret. The last chapter of Margaret's life, penned in letters of love and sorrow, closed without the reunion she had so fervently desired. Yet though her voice was silenced, Margaret Tudor's legacy resonated through the ages. Her trials and tribulations, marked by political triumphs, personal betrayals, and ceaseless maternal devotion, became woven into the tapestry of Scottish and English history. In the annals that followed, she was remembered not merely as the sister of Henry VIII or the penurious Dowager Queen, but as a woman of unyielding spirit. Her final letters, addressed to her brother as "Dear Henry," endure as testament to a bond strained by crown and country, yet never entirely broken. And in the quiet hush of Holyrood's autumn winds, one can still sense the echo of her whispered prayers for unity in a kingdom where throne and heart were often at odds with one another. On October 18th in the year 1541, after suffering a sudden stroke at Methven Castle, Margaret Tudor drew her final gentle breath. The autumn light filtered through narrow windows, casting long shadows across the cold stone floor, as attendants hurried to her side too late. Prince James V, her only surviving son, remained distant, engaged in urgent matters of state at the palace, and did not arrive before she passed. In that unfurnished bedchamber, Margaret's life slipped away in utter solitude, her final moments unaccompanied by the very child she had fought so desperately to protect. The only legacy she left behind, apart from a modest collection of personal effects and a handful of crowned portraits, was a sheaf of letters. Dozens of missives bore the tremulous ink of a woman tormented by regret and indignation. Many were addressed to her brother, King Henry VIII of England, each one laced with the bitterness of betrayal and the ache of clandestine love. Others were intimate reflections on the clandestine affections she had once harboured, as well as proud recollections of moments when she had bested her enemies with cunning and resolve. These letters, bound together in plain vellum, stood as both testament and confession, a final record of a life lived at the intersection of power and passion. Yet Margaret Tudor's true inheritance was not found in palaces or in fleeting political triumphs, but in the bloodlines that followed her. She was the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots, an indomitable figure who would reign with regal determination and rekindle the ancient flame of female sovereignty. Mary's early years, spent in the shadow of her formidable grandmother's story, informed the courage with which she would later confront courts and conspiracies. Further still, Margaret's lineage extended to James I of England, the monarch who, under Providence and by the twist of dynastic fate, would unite the crowns of Scotland and England. In his reign, the echo of his grandmother's vision of a unified realm found at last some measure of fulfillment. Henry VIII, though he secured eternal renown through his 6 momentous marriages and the dramas of succession they wrought, cast only a flickering shadow compared to the enduring glow of the gilded throne that bore Margaret's name. While Henry's legacy was entwined with divorce and religious schism, Margaret's golden crown, so often slipped from her brow by circumstance, shone through history as a symbol of quiet resilience. Her story, whispered in parchment archives and recited in hushed court circles, became the softer undertone to the thunderous saga of the Tudor dynasty. And so, in the final hush that fell over Methven Castle, her tale reached its somnolent close. From her beginnings as a royal child destined to forge political alliances, through the tragic chapters of widowed regency and quixotic romance, to her lonely rest in a remote chamber, Margaret Tudor's life had been a tapestry woven with threads of love and treachery. She had clashed with kings and courtiers, survived betrayals and heartbreaks, and even faced the unkindness of her own flesh and blood. Through it all, she maintained an unbroken resolve, a steadfast heart navigating the tempest of high politics. As night descended over the Scottish hills, a gentle wind carried the distant sound of lapping waves against Methven's shores. In that stillness, one might imagine Margaret's spirit drifting between worlds, a princess who had used her heart as both shield and sword, a dowager queen who had found courage in compassion, a mother who had known the sharpest edges of loss. Her departure left an echo, a lullaby for wandering souls caught in the turmoil of power, for those who have loved and been betrayed, for hearts that yearn for freedom even under the weight of a crown. Thus ends the sombre chronicle of Margaret Tudor, always the sister traversing Henry's grand shadow, often the widow girding her soul against fresh storms, and forever the architect of a legacy that outlasted fleeting intrigues. In the enduring silence of history's corridors, her story remains a whispered lullaby, a testament to a woman who dared to entwine love and sovereignty, only to be remembered not for the glitter of her crown, but for the grace with which she bore its burdens. After being born into the stormy tides of court intrigue, Lady Margaret Douglas, Margaret Tudor's youngest daughter, would sow fresh heartache in her mother's weary soul. The little princess entered the world far from home, growing up in the gilded cage of the English court under the strict orders of King Henry VIII. Separated from her father, Hamish Douglas, she learned early the loneliness of royal exile. As she blossomed into a young woman, Margaret Douglas dared a forbidden affection. She fell in love with a palace yeoman, a man of humble station but gallant bearing. Their love, reckless and tender, could not remain hidden for long. When the affair came to light, Margaret Tudor's world trembled once more. The yeoman was arrested and thrown into the Tower of London, his rough-spun cloak and simple cap replaced by iron shackles and stone walls. Lady Margaret Douglas, too, faced confinement, her chamber doors locked against her mother's frantic pleas. In her chambers at Methven Castle, Margaret Tudor pored over the scant news of her daughter's fate. She penned letter after letter to her brother, Henry VIII, her ink-stained petitions begging him, "Return my daughter to her mother's arms." Yet day turned to week, and week to month, and Henry's silence was as cold and unyielding as the Scottish winter. In those anxious days, Margaret Tudor questioned the price of love. Is affection ever worth the suffering it brings? She recalled the afternoons spent teaching her little girl the alphabet, the tender moment when Margaret Douglas first traced the letters M-A-R-G-A-R-E-T with tiny, eager fingers. She remembered the sparkle of delight in her daughter's eyes when she tasted freedom, free from Tudor's scowls, free from courtly whispers for a fleeting hour each day. Now, that very smile was imprisoned, and Margaret Tudor, once a pillar of power, found her maternal heart tested beyond measure. Each dawn found her at the window of her private chamber, gazing out across the mist-shrouded fields stretching toward the horizon. The grey fog clung to the earth like a veil, obscuring every promise of hope. Beyond the fog lay Edinburgh, bustling with soldiers, courtiers and messengers, yet none brought the relief she craved. With no throne to support her, and no formal authority to summon, Margaret Tudor's sole treasure remained her love for her children. She had once wielded power as regent, orchestrating alliances and quelling rebellions. She had once overthrown her treacherous husband with keen strategy. She had survived the sting of court espionage and the bitterness of betrayal. Still, the agony of losing her daughter burned deeper than any political wound, a scar that no peace treaty could erase. Though time marched relentlessly forward, Margaret never ceased to write. By candlelight she recorded every fragment of news, the date each letter was dispatched, the name of the courier who bore it, the faint replies she received, if any. Each page in her leather-bound journal bore the imprint of her steadfast devotion, ink smudged with tears. These blood-red letters, as her attendants quietly called them, tracked her daughter's plight under Henry VIII's stern guardianship. The pain of separation, compounded by royal indifference, shaped the final years of her life. Now, with her health declining and age bending her frame, Margaret recognized that her greatest legacy would not be the crown she once wore, or the diplomatic accords she once brokered. Instead, it would be the hard-won lessons of sorrow she passed to those who followed. She had survived 6 marriages, each a tempest of loyalty and betrayal. She had been a child princess, an acting queen, a widowed regent, a reluctant spy, and a mother ravaged by grief. Finally, she was merely a woman caught between 2 rival kingdoms, her heart steadfast even as kingdoms rose and fell. On the 16th of October, just 2 days before her final departure, Margaret Tudor completed one last letter to her son James V. In her careful script, "I bequeath to you the royal blood of your forebears, yet not the sword to defend it. You stand as my final hope." Then she raised her weary eyes to the overcast sky, drawing a slow, wistful breath as if shedding every burden she had borne. In that moment, the gleam of her sumptuous crown and the weight of political ambition faded into nothingness. All that remained was the pure, sacred bond of a mother's love, transcending every calculation of statecraft, every betrayal of courtly intrigue. Inheriting the blood of the Tudors, James V ascended the Scottish throne amid swirling diplomatic storms. England pressed insistently for union, while France beckoned Scotland to resist. The new king, barely reconciled with his mother's faded presence, was compelled to wed Mary of Guise to cement the French alliance. The royal betrothal, a duty of state, stood in stark contrast to his fractured bond with Margaret Tudor. She watched with a bittersweet ache as her son, once the laughing child she led by the hand through echoing castle chambers, now wore regal finery, his every gesture guided by political necessity rather than maternal warmth. The memory of those early days haunted her, James's small hand dragging through her fingers, his bright laughter resonating against cold stone walls, a fleeting echo of innocence now lost. In her moments of deepest yearning, Margaret contemplated writing to Mary of Guise, confiding the ravages of a mother torn from her child. Yet prudence prevailed. She knew that any missive, however heartfelt, could stoke tensions between France and England empires poised on the brink of conflict. So she tucked her sorrow away like a precious pearl hidden in an ocean trench, a secret too potent to surface. Despite her confinement to Methven Castle's shadowed corridors, Margaret maintained her role as hostess to envoys from France, England, and Scotland. Draped in a mourning cloak of deepest sable, she clutched a ledger listing prisoners held across the realm. With careful diplomacy, she proposed an exchange: the release of Lady Margaret Douglas in return for Scottish nobles surrendering their claims against her grandson. At the winter feast, beneath the glow of hundreds of candles, Margaret quietly observed the assembled ministers. The flickering light danced in her weary yet determined eyes as she lifted her goblet. Each sip of sweet wine reminded her of the years she had spent navigating betrayal and power, of the love she had fought for and the heartbreak she had endured. Yet, even in this twilight of her influence, Margaret continued to nurture hope through education. She organized small lessons for her daughter and other noble girls, teaching them to read, to stitch, and to hold their heads high regardless of circumstance. These intimate gatherings became her sanctuary, where the light of learning in the princess's eyes rivaled any candle's glow. Margaret understood then that motherhood involved more than guiding a child's steps through palace halls. It meant imparting knowledge and inspiring courage in the next generation. As dusk settled over Methven Castle, Margaret Tudor placed her final instructions upon parchment. In a brief testament, she entrusted her daughter to her brother, Henry VIII, to be reared in England's embrace. To King James V and Mary of Guise, she bequeathed the family's royal treasures, guardians of the Tudor legacy that might one day bridge the chasm between their kingdoms. The squire who carried the shield will later recall Margaret's gentle smile, even as her frail hand relinquished the quill. Though peace remained elusive, she had planted in her children the seeds of hope for unity. In those last hours, Margaret Tudor's spirit soared beyond political strife. She had been princess, regent, widow, spy, and ultimately a mother whose love transcended thrones and borders. Her legacy would live on in Mary, Queen of Scots, whose fiery reign would echo Margaret's resilience, and in James I of England, whose crown would at last unite the lands his grandmother had dreamt of linking. And in the hush that followed her passing, the winds around Methven whispered that a mother's final gift was not a treaty or a diadem, but an enduring belief in the promise of a reconciled future. Stirling Castle, where James V once slipped from Douglas's grasp, now stands as a monument to history's turning tides. Though Margaret Tudor had long since relinquished the crown's weight, she played an indispensable role in laying the foundations for the new reign. She convened with Scotland's earls and ministers in drafty council chambers, her keen mind sharpening policies on agriculture to alleviate the common people's hunger. She pressed for judicial reforms that would curb the overbearing influence of powerful nobles, ensuring that no single lord could wield unchecked authority over the realm. These proposals, penned in Margaret's unmistakable hand, were later codified in James V's statutes, seeds sown by a mother whose vision helped Scotland grow stronger and more just. In the popular imagination, Margaret became known as the wily Queen of Scotland. Tales spread of her fabled use of a fabricated letter to sow distrust within Douglas's faction, forcing her husband's humiliation without drawing sword. She reputedly conjured the spectre of an unyielding woman regent, a phantom threat that quelled rebellious nobles before they could strike. She negotiated with French and English envoys alike, balancing alliances and quarrels with the finesse of a master diplomat. Each anecdote shimmered with romantic intrigue, yet beneath the glamour lay a profound loneliness. A sovereign alone in the hush of midnight corridors, clutching the last love letter she had ever written, her silhouette fleeting against the cold stone. Margaret Tudor's story transcends mere tragedy of power. It is the odyssey of a mother reclaiming her maternal bond and her dignity within a patriarchal order. She was victim and warrior, widow and peacemaker, all in one. Few women of her era matched her deft blend of inner fortitude and political cunning, using compassion as her shield and resolve as her sword. In a world dominated by martial prowess and male ambition, she wielded her intellect and empathy to outmaneuver conspiracies and preserve her family's legacy. Her descendants did not inherit only royal blood or a golden throne, but a spiritual endowment, the resilience to endure adversity, the wisdom to choose mercy over might, and the compassion to uplift the weary. Margaret's legacy offers a timeless lesson on nurturing unity amid chaos, on safeguarding kinship when power and self-interest threaten to tear it apart. In every grain of Scotland's fertile fields and every edict that protected the poor, her guiding hand was felt long after her passing. When darkness settled over Stirling Castle, and the wind whispered through the grasses and stone battlements, the legend of Scotland's wily queen, Margaret Tudor, echoed amid the gloom. They say that if you listen closely, you will hear a soft murmur. Power may wrest a crown from your head, but it can never steal the heart that dares to love and to live. 3 centuries on from Margaret Tudor's turbulent life, her granddaughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, faced her own dramatic end at the hands of Elizabeth I. When Mary was led to the scaffold in 1587, attendants discovered in her private chamber a battered, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, and the ink faded to a ghost of its former intensity. Within its worn leaves, Mary had written tender reflections on her mother, Margaret Tudor, calling her a beacon through the fiercest storm. She recalled how Margaret once braved military encampments to rock her cradle beneath canvas tents, how she fled to England with tear-stained petitions, and how she wove diplomacy from her very anguish. Mary declared that it was Margaret's maternal devotion and unbreakable resolve that forged the royal line into something unparalleled. Centuries later, James I, the monarch who finally united the crowns of Scotland and England, paid homage to his grandmother in his first speech to the English Parliament. In his sonorous voice, he proclaimed, "That diminutive lady, my grandmother, Margaret Tudor, planted the seeds of concord between two realms once bitter enemies, so that this day finds England and Scotland allied in peace." These words elevated Margaret's memory beyond the shadow of her renowned brother, Henry VIII, transforming her into a central figure of post-medieval chronicles and epic verse. Poets and playwrights depicted her as the architect of unity, her courage outshining Henry's chronicles of 6 marriages and ecclesiastical upheaval. Modern historians now regard Margaret Tudor as the archetype of the courageous female statesman. Far from a mere pawn in dynastic marriages, she skillfully wielded the nascent tools of law, diplomacy, and public perception to safeguard her honour and that of her progeny. She left behind a treasure trove of correspondence, royal decrees and treaties, unique documentary legacies that illuminate the inner workings of Tudor Scotland governance. Scholars pore over her dispatches to French ambassadors and her sealed petitions to the English crown, marvelling at her ability to use written words as instruments of power. Today, visitors to Methven Castle and Linlithgow Palace can still stand before imagined portraits of Margaret Tudor, a woman with silvered hair, eyes tinged with sorrow, yet bright with steadfast determination. Her painted visage, draped in velvet and pearls, has become an emblem for women in leadership, symbols of resilience, courage, and grace under pressure. School groups gather in hushed awe as tour guides recount her life's journey, emphasizing how a mother's soft influence can resonate through the harsh corridors of power. Children peer at their own reflections in the glass, wondering what quiet strengths they too might inherit. In the fading glow of lanterns and the gentle whisper of autumn winds, Margaret Tudor's story still whispers its timeless truth, that in a world turned by ambition and conquest, it is love and human dignity that heal the deepest wounds and rise triumphant from the ashes. As darkness settles over castled ramparts and time weaves shadows across ancient stones, let her tale serve as a lullaby for wandering souls, an affirmation that even amid the most turbulent rains, a mother's steadfast heart remains the gentlest, most indomitable force of all. When the first pale glow of dawn brushed the Oakhill hills, the last echo of Margaret Tudor's life still lingered in the ancient stones of her castles. History would remember her as the woman daring enough to love, who relinquished crown and comfort to follow the call of her own heart, even when she was treated as little more than a diplomatic token. A fledgling among eagles, she had navigated storms of courtly ambition, only to learn how to soar above the very thrones that sought to confine her. Posterity did not celebrate Margaret for scandalous marriages like those of her brother, Henry VIII, but for her unyielding resilience in the face of grief. Princess, widow, regent, single mother, reluctant spy, she wore each mantle with steady purpose, never ceasing her quest for freedom and love for herself and her children. Her story stands as a testament to transforming suffering into inner strength, a guiding star for those who find themselves battered by circumstance. In our own age of science and technology, psychologists and advocates for women's rights point to Margaret Tudor's life as a prime example of post-traumatic growth. Here was a woman who endured the loss of children, the betrayal of husbands, and the silencing of her political voice, yet rose again and again, rebuilding her spirit from the fragments of heartbreak. Her journey reminds us that the deepest wounds can also give rise to the fiercest healing. Sometimes, if you walk the misty corridors of Linlithgow Palace at daybreak, you might hear a soft melody drifting on the breeze as though an unseen harp once strummed its strings there, whispering, keep the spark of hope alive. In each dewdrop glistening on the green lawns, you might glimpse the silhouette of that small-framed queen, steadfast in her devotion to her children, to power, and to love. She refused to let the world's ambitions dictate her fate. When Margaret's tale finally drew to a close, a measure of peace descended upon her descendants. Mary, Queen of Scots, bore her grandmother's spirit in her own defiance. And later, James the first to unite the crowns of Scotland and England, fulfilled the dream of harmony that Margaret had long envisioned. Yet beyond thrones and treaties, the truest treasure she left behind was a lesson that even when life scatters loss upon our path, a brave heart and a mother's sacred love can pen a brighter chapter. As night falls and the shadows lengthen across the battlefields and palaces she once knew so well, Margaret Tudor's legacy endures as a warm ember in the darkness. Her name may belong to history, but the flame of her indomitable spirit continues to guide countless souls through their own storms, reminding us that courage and compassion are the greatest crowns we can wear. And now, as the soft tides of Margaret Tudor's story recede like a gentle breeze across the Oakhill Hills, let us slow our hearts and draw a deep, calming breath. Imagine the candlelight in Methven Castle's final chamber, flickering once more, casting warm, dancing shadows on the cool stone walls, before dimming into a tender glow that lingers only in memory. Picture the mother who braved storms of politics and betrayal, now resting peacefully, her cares melting away on the quiet wind that sighs through the turrets. In those lingering moments between wakefulness and dream, remember the message woven through her life's tapestry, that true strength arises not from the glitter of crowns or the clamour of armies, but from the gentle resilience of a loving heart determined to persevere. We carry forward Margaret's legacy each time we choose compassion over cruelty, each time we kindle hope amid despair, and each time we lift another with the soft power of encouragement rather than the harsh weight of command. So let us cradle this story in the palm of our minds as we drift toward rest, allowing its quiet lessons to settle like stardust upon our eyelids. May we release the day's troubles as easily as we might let a feather float on a silent breeze. And may our dreams be guided by the same tenderness that Margaret afforded her children in the darkest hours. As the final outlines of her regal silhouette dissolve into the twilight air, let your breathing slow to a lazy rhythm, your thoughts softened by the promise that even the heaviest burdens can be lightened by love's enduring touch. In the hush of this closing hour, feel the comforting warmth of kinship and courage wrap around you like a velvet cloak, assuring you that tomorrow's dawn, however uncertain, will always bring new possibilities. And now, if your eyes grow heavy and your thoughts begin to drift, know that you carry with you the quiet wisdom of a woman who taught a divided land the power of mercy, and a divided heart the power of forgiveness. Let her story be a gentle lullaby, reminding you that even in the stillness of night, the spark of hope glimmers softly, inviting you onward. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. If you have found in Margaret Tudor's life a flicker of inspiration or a moment of peace, we invite you to subscribe to our channel so that you may dream with us again and discover even more tales that soothe the soul and stir the spirit. Now, close your eyes. Let the whisper of her legacy carry you into a realm of calm. And sleep well, dear friend. Good night.